So we'll take a pause and we're going to introduce Congressman Chris Smith, who is going to present the Victims of Communism Human Rights Award to our honored guest today, Fang Zheng. Congressman Smith is no stranger to, I think, anyone in this room. He has been a champion for human rights and the dignity of every human life throughout his career in public service. He is co-chair of the Victims of Communism Caucus here in the House. He is a senior member of the House Foreign Affairs Committee. He is chairman of the Human Rights Subcommittee, and we thank him for his leadership. He doesn't just do it when it's popular. He does it all the time, and he's a statesman for that, and we appreciate him. Congressman Chris Smith.
Thank you very much, and thank you for the invite to be here, and especially thankful to the Victims of Communism for really shining the bright light on decades after decade, decade after decade, of atrocities committed all over the world by communist dictatorships. It is a record that so often goes missed in the United States and Europe and all over the world, and you are chronicling and making us more vigilant and making us push back even harder against the atrocities that they have committed, that there be an accountability, and hopefully some kind of reconciling, because those who have suffered and their families do need our support, but also that it doesn't happen again. So thank you so much for that. You know, I have a few opening comments, and then I'd like to go to that presentation. I've been asked to speak, so I love it and would take this opportunity, particularly as we remember Tiananmen Square. You know, we are gathered here to solemnly remember Tiananmen Square, the protests, and then the violent suppression. You know, weeks went by. It looked like there might be a change of heart by the part of the communist dictatorship there. We saw it in the Soviet Union, we saw it in Romania, all over these bloc countries, yet it didn't happen, sadly, in China. We remember the massacre every year because there has been no justice whatsoever for those who lost lives and limbs, like Fang Zheng, seeking freedom and reform. We remember Tiananmen because of its enduring impact on U.S.-China relations. We must never forget these seminal events, no matter how much the Chinese government wants the world to forget it. You might recall, some of you, in 1996, I held a series of hearings, began in 2006, on how Google and all these other internet giants, Google especially with their search engine, which is probably one of the best in the world, overtly and aggressively censoring all things Tiananmen. If you use the Google in China, you got wonderful pictures of happy people visiting the square. Use Google here, you got pictures of tanks, bayonets, and people suffering for liberty. So unfortunately, there's been complicity by many, including the corporate community, for decades, and that was just another major example. We also, the world, owes a debt to the leaders of Tiananmen, and they did something that was so heroic. While it did not yield the fruit we were all hoping for, I do believe that that day will come. The Communist Party of China, through bayonets and tanks and killings and torture and tracking down the people who were there, it wasn't just those couple of days. Of course, they continued. Anybody with a fax machine was tracked down. They were looking constantly for people who were part of this great protest. China today, as we all know, is richer and more powerful, more menacing. I've held a series of hearings on Chinese influence around the world, whether it be in Africa, Latin America, or anywhere else. What are they doing? Bringing a bad governance model and the use of surveillance and secret police, and it works in dictatorships especially. Look at what has happened in Sudan. Look what they have done in Iran. Where do you think those capabilities largely have come from? The Chinese model. There is now a war on law, as we call it, a war on religion. And Xi Jinping, sadly, right now, is in a race to the bottom with Kim in North Korea when it comes to human rights abuses. We've seen it. I chair the China Commission. We're looking every year. Our report becomes even more breathtakingly horrible because of what's going on in these countries, in this country, I should say, in every single category. Religion's freedom, the international community and their linkage to NGOs, which has been severed, or at least attempted to be severed. So there's an all-out war on the people of China, and I think the point was made earlier that we don't talk about, China and the people are wonderful. It's the government, unfortunately, that is doing such grave injury to its own people. You know, mention was made earlier by Mr. Sujer about, you know, a little bit of a timeline, and Dr. Yang did it as well. I was also a part of that. In 1989, like everyone else was glued to my seat, this could be the beginning. Not unlike what we saw when the Berlin Wall fell and all of the changes that occurred in Eastern Europe and in what was the Soviet Union in Russia itself. Sadly, it took a bad turn for the worse. I agreed, I'm a Republican, when Bill Clinton said that George Herbert Walker Bush was coddling dictatorship in a famous speech that President Clinton had made as a candidate. And then, frankly, he betrayed the people of China. I remember when he did his executive order. We had the votes in the House to take away most favored nation status. We had the votes. It was an open question whether or not we'd have them in the Senate. And we had a president who looked ready to sign the moment that legislation crossed his desk. At a critical moment, he issued an executive order that said, give him a year, laid out all of these benchmarks that seemingly were achievable. I, as a Republican, took to the microphone over and over again, floor of the House, press conferences, worked with David Bonnier and Nancy Pelosi and Frank Wolf and others, Republican and Democrats alike, saying, thank you, Mr. President, for putting a bright line of demarcation where America will not be complicit in those atrocities. On May 24th, 1994, on a Friday afternoon when everybody was leaving, you know, Congress was out, everybody was on trains and buses, not buses, cars, and certainly jets to the West Coast and elsewhere. He does an executive order evisceration, rips it in half. Significant regression had occurred, not progress, as called for in the executive order, and the people of China were the losers. I, to this day, believe that's when the Chinese took the measure of the United States of America and said, we put profits above human rights, the rule of law, and respect for the individual. And it was a grave and sad day. By then, the coalition that had really rallied around the president began to dissipate. And it looked like now we're not going to get a removal of MFN because even the president now has said there's no linkage between human rights and trade. Of course, the business community were celebrating, and there was this naive thought that somehow if you just trade more, a dictatorship would matriculate from a gross dictatorship littered with laogai and torture would somehow become a democracy, and nothing could have been further from the truth in terms of what has happened and what many of us predicted would happen. I was appalled when President Bill Clinton brought in 1996, Zhou Haitian, the butcher of Beijing, the man who ordered the killings. He brought him, he was now Secretary of Defense, or the equivalent of the Secretary of Defense for all of China. And what did he do? Gave him a 19-gun salute. Well, I put together a hearing. Dr. Yang was one of our lead witnesses, was brilliant that day. It was December 18th, 1996. We invited Zhou Haitian, or anybody from the Chinese embassy, to come and give testimony, because what did he say at the War College while he was here? Nobody died during Tiananmen Square. I mean, you can get away with that, Zhou Haitian, when you are in China, but at least we do have a semblance of a free press here still. And we held that hearing. We had somebody from the People's Daily who actually started to write about this as it was happening. He was hauled off and thrown into jail. Somehow he got out, I won't explain it, got out and came and testified. We had somebody from Time magazine, all these people, students, testifying, and the empty chair for Zhou Haitian. I thought that was a gross sellout, continue to believe that to this day. The enabling has been bipartisan, as is the opposition and the clarity that has come from so many of us who believe if you put human rights first, the rest should follow thereafter, including better trading with that country. Let me just conclude by saying that I believe someday, and I don't believe it's that far off, there will be a celebration of a democracy in China. It'll happen because the people of China, who are tenacious, courageous, we see it in the leaders, Dr. Yang, obviously, and so many others who have suffered so much, Wei Jingsheng, Chen Guangzhen, all of these great leaders who have suffered so much, and yet they continue to push for democracy. Liu Xiaobo, who recently passed. His wife, here he is, the Nobel Peace Prize winner, and the world kind of forgot about him. I was the one who led the effort in the House to name him. Of course, having Václav Havel and so many others pulling for him to get that prize. We had asked that 3 people get it, but Liu Xiaobo got it, and that's the way it should be. I was at the celebration, which had an empty chair again there for the Nobel Peace Prize, and then people kind of forgot about it. Where was the outrage over a dictatorship that jails a great and wonderful non-violent man like Liu Xiaobo and then does such horrible things to his wife and then allows him to die a horrible death from cancer by not treating him? But again, these folks will all be honored someday, as they should be, for the leadership they have provided. Today, I'm introducing a bill, and it's called the Countering the Chinese Government and Communist Party's Political Influence Operations Act. It calls for a major research done by interagency of the federal government that will tell us exactly what they're doing in every area, from the Confucius Institutes, and I've held several hearings on that, as well as how other universities like NYU and others are now getting campuses in China at almost rock bottom price and have the students subsidized. What are they teaching? What are the Confucius Institutes providing in terms of soft power on the part of the Chinese government? We know it's there, we know it's rampant, but we want a really historic landmark study, so that, and it has to be made public, not something done by the FBI that we never see, so that everyone can rally around it. Nancy Kaptur, who's the co-chair of our caucus, she's the chief Democrat co-sponsor, and we're introducing that later today. I've been asked, and this is a real privilege, to make a presentation today, and I'm concluding on that. In 1989, as I know all of you know, Fang Zheng and a group of his fellow students were peacefully protesting in Tiananmen Square when they were hit with tear gas. Mr. Fang selflessly and heroically risked his life to pick up on an unconscious girl and to push her to safety and out of the way of an oncoming tank. The tank crushed both of his legs, which had to be amputated. The pain was excruciating. Despite this horrific crime that he suffered, Mr. Fang went on to win two gold medals and broke 2 regional records in the All-China Disabled Athletic Games in 1992. His spirit remained as indomitable as his body. Mr. Fang refused to say his legs were crushed in a road incident. The Chinese government wanted him to lie, despite their efforts to pressure him to do so. And they did that by denying him his diploma and later barring him from representing China as an athlete with a disability. Mr. Fang is a living reminder of the terrible massacre that the Chinese Communist Party continues to claim never happened. And for this, he was bullied for 20 years. After surviving 2 decades of harassment and surveillance, he started his new life in exile in 2009. Since coming to the US, Mr. Fang has been a tireless advocate for freedom in China. Mr. Fang presides over the Chinese Democracy Education Foundation, which calls for the establishment of democracy and respect for human rights in China. And he has testified in front of the Congressional Executive Commission on China and other bodies of the House, calling on what happened in Tiananmen Square, but also on his dreams and hopes as to where China will go. That is to democracy. For his unflagging fight against tyranny and his commitment to freedom, Mr. Fang is receiving the Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation Human Rights Award. Other recipients of the award include Dolkun Isa, who was awarded by the foundation in 2016 for his principled opposition to the ongoing persecution of the Uyghur Muslim minority in the PRC. At a time when China is intent on exporting its censorship abroad and bullying American individuals and companies to toe the party line, and to cover up all of the atrocities that have been committed by the Chinese Communist Party, we need, and we're so grateful to have, brave voices like Mr. Fang, and we need him now more than ever. Thank you and congratulations.